Welcome to the Wild and Worthy podcast. Today's guest is someone I've been wanting to sit down with for a long time, Martin Lass. Martin is a professional musician, a gold album violinist and a composer, and also a longtime practitioner of the esoteric arts. He has spent nearly 40 years in Gurdjieff's work, has written widely on astrology and spirituality, including the book of Chiron, Healing Body and Soul. And for 15 years was a certified trainer of the Demartini Method before returning to his full focus, Gurdjieff's teachings. In this conversation, Martin and I dive into the collapse process, the core of the Demartini Method, and ask hard questions. Really happens when we turn emotional charge into so-called unconditional love. Why does it feel illuminating in the moment but leave so many of us flat, muted, or cut off from conscience? And what are the consequences of burying conscience under the pressure of group belief or spiritual bypass? We explore the difference between collapsing charge and transforming it, the role of conscience as our inner compass, and the dangers of mistaking numbness for transcendence. Martin speaks candidly about the psychobiological effects of suppressing charge, the concept of buffers that keep us asleep, and why true transformation requires struggle, tension, and the courage to deeply feel. This is not an easy conversation, but it's a necessary one. Our hope is that by sharing our lived experiences, we open space for critical thought, informed consent, and a return to genuine conscience in the search for healing and transformation. So let's get into it. Hi, Martin. Thanks for joining me today. And I've been so looking forward to actually having this conversation with you. One of the main aspects of our conversations is because we've both been involved in the Demartini organization and have questions around the validity of the collapse process relating to transformation and collapsing charge. So we decided to get together and have a conversation regarding that, just to bring some thought discussion around, the potential components that may be problematic with the methodology. So again, thank you for jumping on this pod with me. And so I'm going to just dive straight on in with the questions. So Martin, you've said collapsing charge is not the same as transforming it. What do you mean by that?
We live in a world where we're confronted with opposites. This is what we mean by the world is duality. And the Demartini process is based on this understanding, where our charges are negative emotions, if you like. Every thought that we have is just one side of a larger polarity. And so his process is based around, if we collapse those polarities, we will have a moment of higher understanding where these polarities collapse into greater unity. I think anybody who's done the Demartini should understand that part of it. Now, the problem is that, and he himself answered this when was once asked, what happens after these charges collapse and turn into, he uses the physics comparison of electron, positron collapsing into a photon, higher, and he equates photon with higher consciousness. A flash of light or a flash of illumination, to put it in spiritual terms. And he was quite clear when he said, and this is not a private conversation, but a conversation between several members, not in a class. And he said, they split immediately again. They fall back down into their ground state. And this is an electronics concept that is well understood, that an atom, when it reaches a higher level of energy, has a tendency to fall back into its former state. So what is the net result of doing a process like that, where we collapse multiple charges, we working through an issue, say we hate our mother or something, and we collapse her, and we come to a moment of unconditional love. And I have to say at this point that his process does work. If it's done properly, you will have a moment of illumination. the moment of higher understanding. But it's what happens after that is the important thing. If the result of it is not that something else has been created inside as a result of the process, then that state must naturally fall back down. What goes up must come down. It's a law of gravity, if you like. And those higher energies that were created are fed upon by the lower aspects of ourself. Call it personality or ego or lower self, lower emotions. It's fed upon. And they return to their original state, and it may even descend lower. But something is created from that process. Something's always created when we have two sides of a polarity coming back together again, or where there's a will and intention from a higher state to create a state of duality, to create something new. So in any process, whether it's mechanical or intentional, something is created. In this case, if something intentional is not created, and I'll get to that in a minute, then something unintentional is created at a lower level. So it's about if you like, the ray of creation has an ascending force and a descending force. It latches onto the descending force, and what is created is lower than the consciousness that created it. So we end up with the emboldening, the strengthening of personality, of the ego, of the false self, if you like, as it's set in some other spiritual traditions. Maybe I'll just stop there and let's perhaps clarify some of that.
That'd be fantastic. I think before we go forward or go deeper, we need to enter this conscience and the components that you're actually speaking to. I think it's important to speak to the audience what conscience actually is from maybe a neurocognitive perspective, more of a grounded perspective, and also the aspect of the higher quantum components as well. And if you can, would you be able to talk to us about the feelings associated with conscience and the purpose of us as a human being having conscience? If we have it, it must be there, and it must be there for a purpose, right?
Yes. If we just take from an intellectual perspective, we take polarities. What's the benefit of something I don't like? What's the drawback of things I do like? And we collapse those mental polarities. We can come to a moment perhaps of higher understanding, but it doesn't connect with anything beyond a momentary flash of perhaps mental insight. For it to connect with something deeper and for it to have a transformational effect, it can't be just the mind that's involved. The body must be involved as well, and in particular, the feeling nature needs to be involved. And this moves on to a much wider subject of the law of three, if you like, expressed in Christianity as a Holy Trinity, in Hinduism as Brahma, Shiva, Vishnu, and different spiritual traditions. There are three forces, if you like, three faces of God, it's said in some circles, around which the entire creation has been created, including us. And if we are focused only on one aspect of that, say the mind, you take the mind as the active force, take the body as the passive or denying force, take the feeling as the possible reconciling force. It's the feeling, the real feeling, not talking about negative emotions now, we're talking about the transformation of negative emotions, that's important to understand what needs to be connected with. And the feeling itself is connected to something that's innate in us, which I like, which Gurdjieff, for example, and others have called essence. The Sufis call it essence, the essence of who we are, authentic self, if you wish, although there's a lot of bad circles, the authentic self, as opposed to the surface self-image, ego, personality, which is a shell. So under that shell, there's an essential nature. And at the core of that is a God spark, a spark of divinity. And that spark of divinity is where conscience lies. There's almost like an innate compass in us that is pointed towards the above. And it can tell us, if we're tuned into it, what is becoming and what is unbecoming of human behavior. That's what I call conscience. Now, if we are only dealing with the mental realm and we're collapsing mental charges and we're not connecting with the body and the feeling, most importantly, those three aspects integrated and harmonized, we end up in the mind actually burying conscience for the reasons that I gave in the first section of what we were just talking about. And that is that when there's a collapse and there isn't some transformation that occurs from it, it falls back down. And it begins to be fed upon by the personality, which covers the essence, covers conscience, It actually goes against conscience. And to put it just into practical terms, if anybody listening has done the Demartini process and listened to John talk, we may feel uncomfortable when subjects like rape or murder or abuse, those subjects come up. When he says everything is love, there's nothing but love. And the implication of that is that rape is love, abuse is love, murder is love. It's just a form of love. The alarm bells should be going off in us. And some people, they do. That's our innate conscience speaking. But in the process, because of the environment in which you find ourselves in a seminar like that, with John's very powerful, domineering personality, we find ourselves burying that or pushing it to the side because we're here to learn something. Maybe it's something new. We don't want to be going against what our peers are accepting. There's all kinds of pressures that we're under in that kind of environment to go along with it, at least in the interim, until we can prove for ourselves that rape and murder, etc., are acts of love. So there's a burying of the conscience there.
That sounds incredibly sociopathic and psychopathic in some form. And listening to you say that, because I have been in the inside of that organization and been exposed to and had the experience of what you're actually talking about. And I can say within myself, like there was this innate voice that was speaking to me. But then again, like I can only equate it to like the group environment caused me to become part of that. And I now speak to it as like it was a removal of my moral agency, and the line between self and other, that distinction was removed. And that is also the part of when, we were taught the seer, the seeing, and the seeing are all the same. So therefore, that was the component of unconditional love, that we are all the same. It then distorted the empathetic components that I believe that we were designed to have. And you talk about a triad from spiritual aspect. There is, from my understanding now in my research, that there is a non-negotiable triad when it comes to conscience: the self-other distinction, the empathy and the theory of mind, and then the integration component, the hub in the brain where the cognition and the emotion actually meet. So there's no separation between that, but there's like sitting in the middle of it and holding both parts. I think here we're really looking at the component of self and other, that we have a distinction, and it's our moral compass that creates that distinction between us to be able to empathize with others. But yet inside of this system, that empathy was also, I feel, erased from me. And we were just saying that we're all the same. And therefore our conscience, and again too, there was a lot of teachings around morality being removed. So therefore we didn't have a conscience because it was simply, for me, just melded all into one thing.
So many questions here, so many different angles that really need examining over time. Just to come back to one of the first points, sociopath, for example. I mean, I think we need to understand that what was happening in that environment with John was not intentional. He's not an intentional sociopath. He is himself dealing with the same journey that we're dealing with. I'm going to call it inner wounds of his past, and with the mechanical mechanisms that try to protect him from having to feel that. And for him, without going into too much detail, that caused him to develop a system and a belief system and a method as a result of that helped him to cope with that without having to deal with it, to actually strengthen the shell rather than to break down the shell. And then he teaches this as a method. So there's that aspect. I try not to ascribe intentionality to his actions. That way I can have more compassion for him, which brings us back to this question of compassion. He says compassion is a charge. Come past the ions, the charged particles. If I cannot put myself in another person's shoes, how can I have empathy for them? Empathy is not a charged situation. And his process should take us to a point of compassion and empathy. It should do that. If certain questions are asked and certain other questions are not asked, its process goes so far that it erases all possibility of coming to a state of compassion. The first question, I think, in his process is the most important and the most powerful, and that is, where have I done it? And not even where have others perceived that I've done it, where have I done it? Where do I have this thing that I'm judging? Because as you said just a minute ago, we all have everything. We are all the same as each other in that respect. But until I can actually sit with that, stand before it without justifying it, without rationalizing it, but to sit, as you say, in the tension, in the conscience of that, I can't have compassion for another person. If I see another person who has this particular feature, unless I can see that, feel that, and have remorse for that in myself, I can't have any sense of compassion for the other person. A critical part of that is seeing that until I become more conscious and more intentional, it all happens mechanically. I can't help my negative reactions. They come up. What I do with my negative reactions after that is the critical issue. Other people cannot control their negative reactions. We all spout out immediately. We enter into the electron battle, if you like. It's only when I stop and agree to sit with myself in the truth that I have this. I have all of the elements of the murderer. I have all the elements of the rapist in me. To sit in that. It's the only way I can transform it. I need to see it clearly in myself. And it's not a matter of just seeing it in the mind and through my thoughts and memories and imaginations. It's a matter of seeing how it manifests in my body through tensions, how it manifests in all of my negative emotions. It's all connected. All three aspects of ourselves, the Holy Trinity, if you like, of mind, body, and spirit or feeling nature, it's all connected. I need to see that. I need to sit in the middle of that, to feel it.
To feel it. And I think that is the very pertinent word here, is to actually feel, sit in the emotion to be able to feel it. But yet inside of this methodology, we were taught that feelings were illusions and emotions were lies. And therefore, we were taught that we had to look at our perceptions and then integrate our perceptions between the pairs of opposites. So what would then be the purpose of us having feelings and emotions, and especially the negative feelings, and being able to sit in the tension of that as a human being?
Complex question. Perceptions. Let's just start there. John talks about perceptions. My impression of that, and I could be wrong, my perception of that is that we're talking about mental perceptions. In his physiology, neurology, talks about impressions coming into the body, into the senses, goes into the brain, and depending on how developed the brain is, it comes out a different way. There's a certain amount of processing, and as the layers of the brain increase, there's more processing, more choices, all that kind of stuff that he goes into. But if those perceptions are only mental perceptions that we are processing, the mental perception of even a sensation of being smacked as a child, for example, if it only remains as a mental thing, it can only take us so far. And this leads into what you finished with, and that was, what is the role of our feeling nature? What is the role of the body in all of this? Each of these three aspects of ourselves perceives things differently. They speak different languages. They have a different operating system. They operate at different speeds as well. The brain, the mind, is the slowest out of the three aspects of ourselves. The body is the next fastest, and the emotions are the fastest, or they should be. And because of that, when we have negative emotions, they tend to overtake everything else. They infect the body becomes tense, they infect the mind, we start thinking in certain ways to try and justify it. It goes off in tangents. Well, she did this and she said that, and therefore it must be this, and so I must retaliate. Something like that. So the role of the body is to provide an anchor to the other perceptions. So an anchor, it's real. It's the only thing that it's real. Here it is. Here's my body. I can experience it. I sense my body. It also has an esoteric role, a higher role, in the sense that my higher consciousness depends on the transformation of certain substances and energies that are in the physical body to begin with. This has been lost in a lot of Eastern traditions. The feeling, real feeling, is what comes up when I connect mind to body. If I make a connection, for example, that I sense my hand, I sense the skin, I sense the internal sensations, I see there's tensions in my face, for example. I allow the tensions to fall away. I try to have a smooth face. I don't realize, but I have an expression that I wear constantly, which is, it's on my countenance. All my history, all my past, all my charges, all my illusions are all written on my face. If I can relax the face and all the tensions involved in that, it changes everything else. So there's a connection made between the mind and the body. And in that space that's created by sitting with that, in between these two active and passive forces, or shall we say active and denying force, because the body is a denying force, something else can be created in the middle. And that's real feeling. And that real feeling is connected to essence. And it's like a portal to our higher consciousness, portal to spiritual realms, if you like. But it has to sit in the middle of this polarity. My intention, I see how I am. I don't like how I am. There's remorse of conscience. But I sit in that. I don't try and change it or justify it or rationalize it. I sit in that and something else comes.
So what would be the consequence of collapsing that charge rather than sitting and standing in the tension? What would be the psychobiological consequences of that? How would it affect us? Let's just stay in like the reality form. If we're in a constant state of like collapsing charge rather than sitting in the tension, there must be a purpose for us to sit in the tension.
Yes, and that's the difference between the result of the Demartini process and a different kind of process that we could go through. Just consider you bring a particle of matter and antimatter together, there's a huge explosion. The energy of it is lost, scattered, gone. Same thing with the collapse. We have a collapse, we have a moment of enlightenment, but it's gone. And what descends is particles again, particle decay, as he says in physics. And those particle decay that start to come down create, as we said, the personality, the ego, the false sense of self, and strengthen that part. If we sit in the middle of it, though, not collapsing it, but pondering it, having side by side, sitting in the middle of that, something else is created in that. Let's take just the simplest example. Energy of the mind, the active force directed towards the sensation of the body. And I meditate like that until I can sense the entire body. So there's a connection made between this brain and the body brain. Instead of those particles collapsing each other, they go to create something else, a higher particle. The particle itself is lower than the active force, but it's higher. This is the important part, higher than the passive force, higher than the body, but lower than the mind ultimately. But that something in the middle there is higher than the body. It's what's called the astral body, if you like. Particles of the astral, the second body, which is a vehicle of higher consciousness that's able to connect to higher consciousness. So every effort that I make like that to struggle against my the reactions and automatic impulses creates particles of this higher substance, which if I remain collected, contained in a meditative state, quiet, still, if I dissolve tensions to allow the body to become permeable, something's created in that and it accumulates so that over time, this second body is developed and that allows for higher perceptions to come in through higher organs.
Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm actually hearing here is that the purpose of us to actually stay in tension, not actually collapse the tension and into the next quantum or the next void of nothingness. The purpose of staying in tension is to have creation happen. So if we're collapsing the chart continuously, we have an emotion, we have a feeling, we have a perception that isn't equilibrated in the Demartini world. We're taught, instructed to be able to access the higher mind consciousness. We've got to keep collapsing these charges. But yet it is in creation is where we have to sit in the tension. So what I have noticed and what I experienced myself after being inside of the organization for more than 18 years, and this became an everyday habit for me to do that there is a sense of flatness that happens. And then the aspect of creation, it wasn't occurring. There was a stagnation. There was no movement. And the people that actually reached out and they have spoken to me since I've spoken out about this are saying the same thing, that there is this illusion of balance but yet it actually stops creation. And there seems to be this flatness, this muteness that occurs.
Yeah.
Therefore, so how would you explain that? Or are we designed to actually have an element of tension? The ratio isn't 1-to-1 or 0-to-0.
Well, in the Demartini work, we're told to keep collapsing. You've got to collapse and collapse and collapse. I mean, have you ever tried to throw mud at a wet wall? You can't throw it fast enough to have it all stick. it slides down. So no matter how many collapses you throw at it, if something doesn't stick, then you end up with a loss of energy rather than an accumulation, and a loss of substance as well, potential substance. So what was the last question?
Are we designed to actually not be in that collapse process and the tension, to have an aspect of tension between opposites? Like inside of the method, it's 1-to-1 ratio that we're taught to actually get to equilibrate our perceptions, to synthesize and synchronize complementary opposites. But yet that is what creates a sense of muteness. He will tell us that that is a state of unconditional love, and inside of that there is all power, all knowing, all energy for you to step into creation. But what I experienced, that there is emotional flatness. So in my exiting this organization and working with like neuroscientists and occult recovery specialists and trauma recovery specialists, we are actually designed to have an aspect of tension to be able to have us create. And the word that keeps coming to my mind is tensegrity of Bucky Fuller's, where there has to be equilibrium or a sense of balance of 1-to-1 ratio. It is actually, we need to have like 5-to-2 or 2-to-1 in that ratio to have a sense of creation. There has to be some form of tension for us to create. So when we're constantly in a state of collapse, we're cancelling out that opportunity for creation. So that was my question.
Well, the whole of creation is a breaking of parity. The whole of creation is primarily matter and only a little bit of antimatter. Now, that's not the ultimate truth. The ultimate truth of the absolute is a singularity, yes. But in manifestation, in creation, one side needs to have more than the other side, just to put it in really basic terms. So in terms of us as reflections of the absolute, or of God, or of singularity, whatever we want to call it, as reflections of that, we have the same possibilities inherent in that. We have the same possibility of creation. We have the same possibility of sitting as a nexus between the higher and the lower. Demartini's method is mostly about the opposites on a horizontal level. He does speak about, if we collapse those, it will take us in a vertical level. But I don't find that's true because, well, it is true. You've got a vertical level, you have a moment of enlightenment, but it falls back down again. What's more interesting is to sit in that tension between for example, what I see that I am in remorse of conscience and what I could be and what my destiny is. That brings it to a vertical focus. Here's where I am. Here's where my conscience tells me I should be. And there's a tension, there's a suffering in that. There has to be a suffering, a struggle. And I struggle with all of these aspects here that keep me dense and grounded. I struggle with them. I struggle not to express my negative emotions outwardly. I can't stop them. The collapse process seeks to collapse those negative emotions. And in doing so, it's only really rationalizing and justifying them. If I can sit in the negative emotion, but without losing the energy by blowing off at somebody or by having a fit or by succumbing to tensions, if I can sit in that, realize that this is what it's not who I am, but it's what I am in this moment. I'm experiencing this. That tension creates a transformation. I struggle with that. I need to struggle with all of my mechanical manifestations. And that struggle itself, that friction, it's the friction that creates the pearl, that creates something in us that's able to connect with the higher, to have the feeling center to connect with the higher. What you said before was very telling, to feel flat after these collapse processes. And after, I did 15 years with him, to feel flat, as nothing had changed. And he says, well, that's unconditioned. No, it's not. You're not sitting in a higher state. You're sitting in stagnation because there's nothing in us that corresponds to the higher. We need to create this higher energetic body that corresponds to the higher. And after that, there's another higher energetic body. The East has astral, mental, causal bodies. And the ultimate body, the Vajra body, as Tibetan Buddhism says, these are vehicles of higher consciousness. They need to be created for us to connect. Otherwise, we sit under the Bodhi tree meditating until the cows come home and nothing happens. We end up feeling flat or depressed and purposeless.
I think in one of our conversations, you mentioned the Sufi warning about higher sleep, right? So can you explain how false higher states, if not transform, lead to stagnation and spiritual flatness?
Yes. Let's say we do a very powerful collapse on somebody very important in our lives, and we have a moment of unconditional love. But then we find that after a time, this subsides. It kind of wears off, and we're told, well, then do another collapse. Collapse this person, we have to do 749 and 49 times 7 collapses. Higher sleep is when we're seeking to have those enlightenment experiences without any pain, without any suffering. Every time we have a negative emotion, what is the impulse in people that they want to collapse these things? They're in a state of disequilibrium. A state is uncomfortable, a state that is painful, and we're suffering in that, suffering in a mechanical way. Our lower self wants to get out of that. It wants, just as Demartini says, we're seeking pleasure, comfort, satiation, safety, survival, all those things, the hierarchy of values. We're seeking all those things. The lower self is seeking that. So in the same way, we take the Demartini process as a way to get rid of the discomfort of our negative states.
Yeah.
Instead of realizing that I need to use this, I can use this, I can eat this energy for my higher development.
And I think that is no different to taking a painkiller or taking a SSRI or snorting coke just to eradicate the feeling of emotional pain inside of you. But it's also linked to, in my perception and my experience, it's also linked to the teachings of that our emotions are lies and our feelings are, our emotions are illusions and feelings are lies. So we want to get to that trained higher state that, I call it now a superego, interject that belief system that, well, when we get there, we'll find Nirvana or God or, Brahma or Brahma Atman, the highest form of the soul or being that's the selling to us. But yeah, I'm absolutely hearing you and in sitting in that tension now. And there's some of the practices that I have been exploring, sitting with the emotions and the feelings and what do they have to offer? Like, what's the purpose of those, and asking those questions internally. Let's just say, if collapsing charge dulls the nervous system and bypasses, let's go back to conscience, does this also collapse agency, making people easier to control?
Of course, because if our conscience is buried, we've got no measuring stick. We've got no sense of values. We have these imposed values that he's given us. Our inner values are determined by our conscience. And so after a while of denying our conscience, we only have external guides to follow, which is exactly what he's seeking to get rid of. This is externally controlled by social morals and ethics and all those sort of things. And yet it's creating that same thing. It's creating a reliance on his values, ultimately.
So it's actually creating mini-me's.
Yes.
Within
and that's why
his
so many
own value
people want to
system.
become Demartini trainers when they never even had that idea when they joined the Demartini work. A Demartini facilitator, and did a whole year's worth of that kind of work as well. And I realized, I'm a musician. Music is my heart. I'm fascinated by consciousness. These are my two passions. But I was completely sidestepping that by wanting to become a Demartini facilitator and to help people. Made me feel good, but it didn't ultimately answer that thing in me that was seeking expression, seeking manifestation, seeking creativity. And that was through my music. And that was a hard one to really come to. But when I saw it, it was just absolutely clear.
Did you feel like that inner light was gradually getting dampened out through I'm going to say, like the interjects and the colonization of that belief system, dampening out that inner spark of you being a musician?
It was covering it up. It was growing my ego. And I remember one point standing up at the whiteboard in front of a group of people, and they were asking questions and I was explaining, but there was this thing in the back of me saying, "You're a fucking fraud. You don't actually know these things from personal experience. You're parroting." I didn't want to hear that, but this little voice was saying, you're parroting these ideas. What do you actually know from your personal experience? And I'm not talking about experiences of the collapse. Conscience, absolutely. It was my essence saying, what the fuck? No.
Yeah.
You've put me
So
in a cage here and not allowed me to come out and play.
this is really, for me, a pertinent moment, because in the teachings, then we would have an understanding that inner voice, and then there would be the outer voice, which would be the vectors in the moment, synchronizing and synthesizing. So that was the state of unconditional love, of the two parts being coming into whole. You can't have one without the other. I listened to a very good podcast last night relative to that, and that is actually the definition of a narcissist, because there's two voices in the head that is playing out in the moment. Exactly. But yet I feel you on that, because that was exactly what was happening to me too as well, is the belief system was implanted, installed, whatever word you want to use, that we were working towards something higher. And once we actually got there, which is a bait for us to move towards, but yet it's an implant of somebody else's value system and their set of beliefs being installed.
If you don't get the results, it's because you're not doing it right.
Yes, yeah, that victim blaming mentality. So this is where we step into understanding coercive control in terms of mind control and cultic behavior, to have the followers become like the leader as such.
Yeah.
And that burying of a person's conscience is so rife throughout that whole organization, including the morality side of things. We step back into the morality of abuse and rape. It gives permission to say that that's unconditional love for anybody to experience that or to do that. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, there is the conscience is sidestepped inside of us to say, well, it's all love, it's all unconditional love, and for the master, everything serves, was the words that I have stamped in my head, which I'm trying to remove.
Yes. And he said repeatedly, I don't know whether in later years, but in the early years, repeatedly saying, the test that we've learned to love something is if we can then go back and create it or become it. In other words, if you've learned to love rape, the test of it is that can you go out and rape somebody, whether that's metaphorical or actually, and realize that it's love. That's just like...
That's fucked up. I'm going to say it. Like, that's totally fucked up.
My brain's
It's
exploding.
totally fucked up.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is totally fucked up, and it gives permission for the morality and the ethical parts of us, of what is right and wrong, to come into play. And I step into now, like, even the aspect of there is no right or wrong, there is just love, was a constant saying too as well. So I really struggle talking about this now, because I can see that was wrong. That is wrong. That is so more than fucked up than anything that I can even speak to at the moment.
Yes, but I have to sit in that. I have to see what happened. I have to, in this moment, not as a past memory and going into guilt and shame about it. I have to be in conscience. Conscience is in the moment. Guilt and shame are in the past or in my imagination, past or future. Conscience is sitting here now. This is how I was in those moments. Somehow something in me allowed me to push my conscience aside, my mechanicality, my habitual thing, my wish to fit in, my wish to be a better person, but in kind of the wrong way. All of these things caused me to push that aside and left me prey to the forces that were promoting it.
So are they the buffers that you and I have been talking about? Like, you mentioned the idea of buffers and the inner mechanisms that actually keep us comfortable or asleep, or always in the right, especially when we're actually taught to collapse abuse or trauma into a state of love. These are the buffers that actually bury the conscience?
Let's take it as simply as possible, starting with the Demartini's first question. Where have I done it? Or where am I like that? There's enormous buffers in us that don't want to admit, that keep us safe from seeing where I'm the same as another person I'm judging. So his process, the first question, should help us to remove those buffers. But it's what he does after that with the process. What's the benefit that I have this in me? Benefit to me, benefit to other people. No, he turns it into something good. balance between the negative and the positive.
Let's just, for the listeners, is the next question is if there's something that you're judging within yourself or another person for doing something, let's just use the word, well, we weren't allowed to use the word abuse because that was a label. We had to break it down into subset of traits. So we take the aspect of somebody that punched me. Where have I done that? And how did that benefit the person that I did it to?
Just making it okay.
Yeah, exactly. And then how was it a benefit of service to them in their highest values? So it's,
How the
in a
fuck am I
way,
supposed to know that? That's just in pure imagination.
pure imagination, absolutely. It's also admonishing our conscience that's within us, the natural aspect of guilt and shame. And the next question goes into that is to minimize guilt and shame. So it's taking all of those aspects out and, then the rest of the questions. So that within itself is, I feel, is nefarious.
So much of what we've talked about this morning, I mean, even just this idea that he promotes that as a test of learning how to love something, you have to reproduce it yourself, that's enough to bring him down completely. Now, I don't want to do that, but I would like to throw some light for people so that they can wake up to this for themselves. I mean, I would have to suffer the consequences as you would if I were to bring Demartini down by promoting that this is the basis of his system. I would have to deal with the consequences of that, and that's taking time out of the things that I am here to do, that I love to do. It's a distraction. But at the same time, because one of my loves is consciousness, I have a commitment almost to myself, commitment to others to share that, as we're doing here in this podcast. I think that's probably the most wonderful benefit of it, is it's shining light on the whole thing.
Well, that in itself is, like I've been speaking to the contraindications of the Demartini method, because they are not anywhere. He doesn't talk about the downsides of Demartini method. And there is no informed consent when you actually go into these events to actually understand the contraindications of it. So even by just in the same aspect of the complementary opposites to his work, then I feel that we're actually just providing the downside, the drawback, the contraindications to the method, and the probable complications that may be inferred or occurred in the future. From my experience, from what occurred to me, what happened to my husband, and many other people that have spoken out now, I feel like my conscience is actually returning relative to that. Well, it was there, obviously protecting me the whole time, but yes, very much covered over, like in a thick layer of mud of the method on top of it. But that tiny little spark is actually, no, this is not right. This is not right. This is actually harming in some form. So my conscience in that is wanting to speak out and have people understand, create a sense of agency, ask deeper questions, and keep your critical thought in place when you're actually entering into this domain, and before it actually disappears, like your critical thought. This is a whole other conversation about what it also creates with that too as well. And
I like your word contraindications, because they're not discussed. They're not revealed at the beginning. I don't know whether he has a disclaimer thing that you have to sign at the beginning of a process anymore. He didn't way back when. No disclaimers, no agreements of anything, but the contraindications of what could go wrong were never discussed. Now, if he was in medical practice, he'd be without his license in a heartbeat. Every drug that gets released on the market, they have to list the contraindications, even if they try and bury that to the public. They are there. And as he himself says, everything that has a benefit has drawbacks. His system has benefits, but it also has drawbacks. We should be aware of those before going into it.
In cultic systems, there is a proponent of a shared fantasy. So you can see that, playing out really clearly, that the shared fantasy space has been created and the fantasy is what is being sold. And, there's all other elements of how people actually caught into that relative to that. But yes, most industries in Australia that are helping or proclaiming to help people with mental health or with psychological disorders, and what does he call it? Human potential, raising your human potential, anything to do with the human body has to follow a certain amount of occupational health and safety, work safe standards. And I feel like this has fallen way, way beyond that, because clearly they are not.
Yep, absolutely.
So in closing, I'd like to look at in systems like Demartini's, unconditional love is framed as the endpoint. What is the danger in mistaking like temporary illumination for permanent change of being?
Higher sleep. Higher sleep.
that
This
higher
is one of the dangers. The other danger
The
is
muteness.
just falling further into sleep in imagination, imagining that I've attained something, imagining that, and in the worst cases, it could even lead to dissociation, to mental instability, because aspects of ourselves are being cut off from us, conscience in particular. Without a connection to our essential nature, we're subject to all kinds of disorders of the personality.
Well, thank you for having this conversation with me today. I know there's so much more that we could definitely talk about, and I'm sure we will. We'll probably get you on another podcast. But I just want to say thank you. If there's anything that you want to actually leave the listeners with, then go ahead and share.
So I could leave just one thing that may start to assist people in dealing with what they might have gone through in this, or in beginning or continuing a spiritual pursuit. It would be, remember that you breathe. Because the breath is the food of the emotional nature, of our feeling nature. In the air, there are substances that come from the sun, from higher consciousness. Infused in the air is higher food, prana, even higher than that. That if I bring awareness to the breath, and I sit with that in whatever turmoil I might be going through, and I try to relax the body at the same time, I can begin a real journey.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
That brings us to an end of today's episode with Martin Lass. You'll find all of Martin's details in the show notes. If you found value in this conversation, click like, hit subscribe, and share it with someone you think would benefit from hearing it. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.